Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'd just like to introduce our webinar. It's the Research Data Management Call 2 webinar. And my name is Laura Lamar, and I'm the Program Operations Manager. With me today is Mark Leggett, and he's the Executive Director of Research Data here at Canary. And he'll be walking you through the first part of the presentation. After his part of the presentation, we'll be going to some questions. The second part of the presentation will be Tracy Murray, and she's the Director of Finance here at Canary. She will be walking you through her slides, and then she will be taking questions at the end of her slides as well. Also with me is Hervé, and he will be introducing himself right now.
Bonjour, mon nom c'est Hervé Guy. Mon rôle, ce serait de traduire vos questions s'ils sont posés en français et puis de retourner les réponses en français aussi. Merci.
Merci, Hervé. Okay, Mark, we're ready for you to start the first phase of the webinar.
All right, thanks, Laura. So as Laura said, I'm going to do a kind of an opening context set of slides about the new call, and then I'll have a set of slides that attempt to answer some common questions, and then Laura will help queue up any questions that have been typed in from listeners. I would encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom in your Zoom interface. That's probably the easiest way to queue up questions and indicate when they're answered. So we'll go ahead then with the next slide. So just to have context, currently, not just in Canada, but elsewhere internationally, the research data management ecosystem tends to be somewhat siloized. There are any number of research platforms and data repositories and systems that function within a specific institutional context, very common, or domain-specific context, and don't necessarily have a great deal of intersection or interoperability with other systems. And there are also a plethora of, as many of you know, standards, protocols, APIs, metadata schemas, and all kinds of computer services and the like that are used to provide the kinds of services and resources that researchers need during their research activity. There's also quite a range of storage options. Sometimes researchers are using commercial storage options for their research data, whether it's a Dropbox type system or others. So very much a fragmented ecosystem. This has started to change a bit. Next slide, please. I think the emergence of large interoperable systems in other jurisdictions such as Europe and Australia and elsewhere, as well as recent Canary funding and other Canadian funders, has helped to facilitate greater interoperability and intersections between systems. So not only that, but also international standards and best practices are being discussed and developed in communities like the Research Data Alliance, or RDA. The last few years has seen the emergence of the FAIR principles, which stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. And the FAIR principles have gone a long way to helping to define more consistent and standard approaches to not just the infrastructure that services researchers, but also the way researchers handle their data all throughout the research lifecycle. There are also emerging best practices in terms of, for example, data repositories, whether it's things like a core trust seal or options as cloud services emerge and mature to have a more, I suppose, consistent and common approach to storage, and that includes common storage APIs and interfaces. National Storage Compute Network Services. Of course, Compute Canada has been doing a lot of work in providing not just HPC, but also with systems like Globus common file tools, not just for active storage, but also longer term storage. And we also see the emergence of national platforms through efforts like those of, again, Compute Canada and their partners with a system like the Federated Research Data Repository, the Carl Portage Network. So lots of activity in this context. So that's good to see. And but Canary's identified a keen interest on the part of the Canadian infrastructure community in terms of facilitating even greater interoperability and adoption of things like international standards and the FAIR principles. Next slide. So part of the response to that interest, and part of this interest has come through in a number of ways. One was a community consultation that Canary did in 2017, and there's also been 2 National Data Services Framework Summits, the most recent one this past January, which helped to define some common interests on the part of the community. So in response to that, Canary did their first research data management call a year ago. And the purpose of that call was to focus on mostly enhancements to existing software platforms and infrastructure that would facilitate greater adherence to the FAIR principles. And as well as other best practices, and thereby facilitate researchers' ability to respond to things like funder policy, publisher policies in terms of data deposit, those kinds of things. There was also an interest in the first call to align with national international standards and to facilitate that best practice sharing. So that call resulted in 9 research data management focused projects being awarded up to 3.2 million in funding. Those projects are well underway. They wrap up at the end of this fiscal year in March 2020. And so those projects have had 18 months to work on the components that they had proposed in their successful projects. And those projects are across both political jurisdictions in Canada, as well as a good cross-section of what I would call generic, non-disciplinary research data management projects and platforms, as well as discipline-specific platforms. So a good mix, and also a good mix of enhancements being made to mostly existing software frameworks in order to, as I said, adhere to those FAIR principles and build software that facilitates the adoption of best practices by researchers nationally. Next slide. So in response to that first call, just a week ago, Canary released the Research Data Management Call 2. It was released at the same time as a new funding call for Canary's research software program. So there are 2 concurrent calls with a couple of important differences that I'll highlight here. A key difference is with the research data management call, again, its focus is obviously on research data management components, whether they be full platforms or data repositories or separate services or components. So this call is making up to $2 million available for projects that continue the effort that was started with that first call. The maximum amount of funding per project is $700,000. And the funding is intended for projects that involve multi-institutional collaborations representing platforms, data repositories, services that are currently non-interoperable, and that will be integrated via one or more functional layers, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail shortly, and thereby addressing or increasing that interoperability aspect of the ecosystem that is so important. So a few kind of keywords here, multi-institutional collaboration. So the intention is to encourage proposals that take currently disparate or separate platforms and research infrastructure and make them more interoperable in one or more functional layers. Next slide. And the call is deliberately high level because, of course, as with any call like this, we're looking for the community to propose what they feel is important or what they feel will move the ecosystem forward, and especially in that context of national and interoperable data management services. So these are the 7 functional layers that were listed in the call documents. The 8th is there because clearly functional layers are not only more numerous than the 7 in pretty much any software platform, but also may well be quite different from research domain to research domain. The 7 are fairly consistent, and we're also saw a lot of common ground among the 9 projects that were funded in the first call. So I won't go into a great deal of detail, but discovery, clearly I think there's an interest in facilitating discovery of research outputs, whether a final data set or any of the other documents or materials that might be created, whether it's software algorithms used to do the analysis, original data management plans, all of the kinds of things that you can think of that are associated with a research project throughout that research lifecycle, and doing so in a national or international context. So facilitating discovery, metadata interoperability. One of the big challenges often in having an effective discovery at any level is the complexity of research metadata, and often the need to rationalize or map individual metadata schemas to some kind of common profile that would facilitate discovery through a common interface. So whether that metadata interoperability is achieved through some level of mapping or enhanced software tools that facilitate mapping, or in the adoption of common metadata schemas in multiple disparate platforms. Persistent IDs are increasingly seen as an important part of the framework, whether it's the creation, use, or maintenance of those IDs, and whether it be things like ORCIDs or DOIs, an increasing number of IDs in other contexts. Fair service registries, APIs, protocols. So this simply refers to that layer of a piece of infrastructure that facilitates a service-based architecture or the kinds of architectures that are typically present in today's web-based systems, and including things like whether it's Open API or other protocols that try to provide a consistent approach to programming and communicating between systems. Metadata deposit and harvest, how can we facilitate more efficient and effective deposit across systems as well as harvesting? Identity management, making it easier for researchers to log in and take advantage of systems is an increasingly important option. And then an efficient approach to storage, whether it's active storage, repository storage, or preservation storage. And then, as category 8 indicates, there's any number of other functional layers that could also be critically important in a particular discipline or platform. So the interest here is seeing the enhancement of existing infrastructures in terms of interoperability with a focus on one or more of these functional layers in a particular proposal. Next slide. That focus on interoperability via functional layers, of course, also still assumes that the adherence or reflection of the FAIR principles is reflected in those developments, and also that those enhancements and increase in interoperability has a clear impact on accessibility to these kinds of services in a national context. And in any particular project, that could mean within a particular discipline or across any discipline in terms of the services that are provided. Next slide. So this is the same slide as I showed at the top of the presentation, and this is simply intended to reinforce or emphasize that interest in that the wheel in the middle there with interoperability and interoperability across all levels. Ideally, that interoperability circle would stretch all the way down to storage, compute, and network services. But I think the diagram should provide a good illustration of the focus that we're looking for in terms of the proposals in a response to this funding call. Next slide. Next slide. So the next couple of slides will just try to anticipate either some of the common questions Canary tends to get with funding opportunities. Ones that we've anticipated may come with this new call. And again, I would encourage you, after the 5th slide, we'll pause and ask if there are any questions. And I see there's one question already typed into the Q&A. So feel free to type your questions at any point in time. And we will pause in a few minutes when I've gone through these 5, and then also at the end of Tracy's presentation on the financial aspects. So the first question is, can funding be used to develop new software components and tools from scratch? As I've alluded to in a number of the comments, the goal of this call is to enhance existing software, specifically in that context of interoperability of existing infrastructure. Clearly, if within that context new components are created, new modules or software components, then that is quite appropriate. But again, the focus of this call is not the creation of completely new platforms, but enhancement of existing. Does existing software that is leveraged have to have been originally funded by Canary? And the simple answer to that is no. It can be any software. Next slide. Does the call focus on a specific type of research data? No, the call is interested in infrastructure that facilitates research in any and all disciplines. Can funded participants from Canary's research software program or the first RDM call also benefit from funding available under this call? The answer is yes. And that assumes that it addresses the FAIR principles and multi-system interoperability at national and international levels. So again, highlighting that the focus of this call is that interoperability piece. Are there examples of existing national data services that could be used? Yes, there are a number of them, some of them in specific disciplines. But in terms of national data services that are in that generic or multidisciplinary context, and examples are the Portage DMP Assistant, FERDER, the Hub Zero project, which Canary has facilitated a few projects using that system, Scholars Portal Dataverse, and there are others. and clearly also others in specific domains as well. Next slide. Does the developed software have to support all FAIR principles? No. Clearly, large nationally focused systems that focus on a particular element, such as discovery, would probably touch on many of those FAIR principles. But a proposal could very well propose the integration of something that has a focus on one of those FAIR principles. Having said that, support for FAIR and broad support for FAIR is part of the scoring criteria during that review process. In a similar kind of context, does the developed software have to support all the listed functional layers? And the answer is no. Again, the focus is on interoperability, highlighting interoperability as much as possible of multiple existing platforms, repositories, and services at one or more of those functional layers. And again, like the adherence to FAIR principles in the effort, support for functional layers is also part of the scoring criteria. And that may well mean that proposals that address multiple functional layers are supported higher, or the kind of support that is proposed for one functional layer may be sufficiently robust and innovative to be scored high as well. So there's no clear formula in either of these. Next slide. Does the software developed with the funding need to be accessible to all researchers regardless of discipline or organizational type? And as I have said on a couple of occasions, the answer to that would be no. But it would be accessible or should be accessible to all Canadian researchers in a specific discipline or all Canadian researchers in general. Can applicants partner with international organizations? Yes, they can. The principal investigator for the project must be from a Canadian institution, and funds must be spent on resources based in Canada. Having said that, projects are able to leverage partnerships with international colleagues, but they would have to bring resources to the table if they're looking to fund HQP or resources outside of Canada. Next slide. We talk about interoperability between multiple systems. So it begs the question of, is there a specific number of systems? Again, the answer is no. But as with the other FAIR principles and interoperability and functional layers, the number of systems is also forms one of the scoring criteria in the review matrix. So that will be a consideration. So I'll pause there and just encourage people again to type in any questions they may have. Laura, do you want me to just go ahead and respond to the two that are there now? Don't have audio if you are responding, so I'll go ahead and...
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, I'll just proceed and I'll read off the first question and then you can answer it just so that everybody can listen along.
Okay.
With a smaller funding envelope for call 2 and a longer time period, 2 years, how would the evaluation and assessment of the applications be different this time?
I don't, so some of the examples of the difference in evaluation and assessment I've mentioned in the Q&A. So for example, the number of systems that will be considered, the reflection of enhancement of interoperability in terms of one or more of the functional layers. So those are two differences that weren't part of the review and evaluation in the first call. I don't think there's any substantive difference in how the proposals will be reviewed given the difference in potential funding or the time period. It is 24 months instead of 18. But again, I don't believe that any of those parameters that are asked about in that question will have any substantial change in the way that the review is done.
Okay, and we have a second question. Does existing software include only those already recognized as part of the National Data Service layer, or can it be existing software in use and recognized within a specific disciplinary data community?
Absolutely. I think the goal is to encourage just exactly what that question gets at, and that is whether they're data repositories or elements of research infrastructure that currently operate in, I'll say, in isolation or in a unique context. I think the funding is designed to encourage those types of systems to be brought into a common framework and to be made interoperable. So there is no preference for or no preference for any of the existing what might be called nationally functional research infrastructure platforms or components. So it definitely an emphasis on bringing currently separate systems together and making them more interoperable.
That's all our questions for right now.
Yeah, so people can type other questions if they occur to them, but we might as well go ahead with the financial piece. Oh, sorry, I forgot one slide. Before Tracy comes up, just to reiterate, so the launch was on the 5th of September. Submissions are due October 29th. And I want to highlight that one because the submission deadline for calls under the separate research software call are a month later, towards the end of November. So it's important for people to remember that if they're applying for this RDM funding opportunity, that the deadline for submissions is October 29th. Evaluation notification will happen before the end of the calendar year, during November, December. And then once recommended project PIs are contacted and agreements are finalized during January to March, then the project development will commence starting April 1. And the end of the funding period will be March 31st. So that's a full 2 years. As with all Canary research infrastructure projects, there is a update call between Canary colleagues and the project team on the funded project every 6 weeks. So those will also be in effect for successful projects in this call. And as with the previous RDM workshop, which took place this past January, the goal is to have the funded project participants participate in, at this point in time, we're assuming one RDM workshop in each of the coming 2 years, and participants will be funded to attend. So those are just a couple of additional comments in terms of a timing context. Pass it over to you now, Tracy.
Thanks, Mark. Next slide, Claire. Good afternoon. I'm going to take you through the financial aspect of this funding call, and we'll start with preparing the budget. So is there anything that you need to know before completing the budget? And the answer to that is yes. You need to know that all project costs that you include in the budget must align with a schedule of eligible costs. So how do you know if a cost is eligible? You can refer to the schedule of eligible costs. You'll find definitions and descriptions of all of the variety of costs that are included as eligible for this call. But I'll just go over them at a high level quickly. The eligible costs include direct labor. So direct labor is salary and fringe benefits. Those salary and fringe benefits will be the amounts that we would find back in your payroll records, in your accounting records. We also eligible for funding are direct materials for this call. That's limited to software license fees, those license fees that are required for software for this project to deliver on the statement of work. Also eligible for funding is the fees or the cost of Canadian subcontractors and consultants who are working on the project, as well as training and travel. One thing I'd like to note about the travel, Mark just mentioned that you would be successful applicants, participants in this program will be attending 1 to 2 workshops throughout the project. And those workshops will be funded under a different mechanism, so you wouldn't include those in your budget. Next slide, please. Okay, so are there any eligible project costs that you should be aware of when you're preparing your budget? And the answer to that question is yes, there's 4. The first one is that employee fringe benefits must not exceed 20% of eligible direct labor costs. The second one is the total of the Canadian subcontractor and consulting fees must not exceed 5% of total eligible project costs. You'll find when you're preparing the budget that the budget will give you warnings. The template will has warnings included in it if you're exceeding these maximums. The third maximum that you need to be aware of is the direct materials. So this is these costs, the software license costs must not exceed 5% of the total eligible project costs. And the last maximum is on travel. Domestic travel must not exceed 3% of the total of eligible project costs. And I'd like to note that only domestic travel is eligible for funding. Next slide, thanks Claire. So a question that we get a lot when people are preparing these budgets is, can you include any overhead in the budget? And the answer is no, you can't claim any overhead. And some examples of overhead would be office supplies, utilities, rent, markup of salaries, office equipment, etc. So there is a list in the schedule of eligible costs, a more fulsome list of non-eligible costs that you can refer to as you're preparing your budget. The next question, can I include sales taxes? You can include, yes you can, but that's limited to the non-recoverable portion of the sales tax. So in the event that you get a refund from CRA for sales tax, that part needs to be excluded. You'll find when you're preparing your budget, there's a section on in-kind. So all of these projects require an in-kind contribution. So the first question is, what qualifies as an in-kind contribution? For these, in-kind contributions are limited to the salary and fringe benefits paid at the rates shown in your payroll and your accounting records. And this is typically limited to university faculty, the principal investigator, senior management. That's what the types of costs that we would expect to see in the in-kind section of your budget. One thing to note is that if the person you're including or people that you're including in the in-kind section of your budget are not paid a salary, their time and won't qualify as an in-kind contribution. So is there a minimum in-kind contribution? The answer is yes. It's a minimum of at least 15% of each quarter's eligible project costs. So now I'll jump into the funding itself. Before I jump into the funding, while you're preparing these budgets to accompany your submission, if you have questions, you can certainly ask the Canary team here. Be happy to answer them. So Canary funding. Our funding might be a little bit different than some of the funding you've received in the past. If you're new to the Canary funding model, our funding is claims-based. And what that means to you is that during the project, you'll submit quarterly claims. So it's retroactive funding. at the end of each quarter, 15 days after the quarter, 15 to 20 days after the quarter, we would expect your claims in, and then we process them. Each of your claims will, when you submit a claim in, the claim will be paid, but there will be a 10% holdback, and that 10% holdback is going to be released at the end of the project. So once the project has gone through and completed all of the technical requirements, as well as successfully completed the audit, the 10% holdback is released to the organization, to your organization. Next slide. Great. So what supporting documentation is required before the first claim? So before you submit your first claim in, Canary will require proof of salary and proof of fringe benefits for all the employees working on the project. This includes the employees in the in-kind section and any employees coming from your participants. When you submit each claim, you'll be required, each employee on the project, both from your institution and from any participants that you include in your budget, will be required to submit time records. Should also mention that this will, all of the employees included in the in-kind section of the budget will also be required to submit time records to support the actual hours worked on the project by the employees. The other thing that we'll be looking for when the claims are submitted are any expenses, including employee travel expenses, where the total cost is greater than $1,000. Okay, last but not least, will the project finances be audited? And the answer is yes, all projects are audited. We can audit at any time during the project, but typically audits are scheduled for after the conclusion of the technical requirements of the project, so at the end of the project. And I'm happy to take any finance-related questions that you may have. Go to the next slide. Oh, never there. So if you have any questions about, if you have any questions about the financial aspect of this call, when preparing your budgets, please contact Programs at Canary, and we'll be happy to respond to those and help you with your budget. And
seeing this, Tracy, makes me wonder, I can't remember if we added the RDM at canary.ca email for people that might have questions related to the nature of the call.
So we would ask that all questions related to the nature of the call get sent to programs@canary.ca. Sorry, it's not just limited to the finance side. So if you have questions, any questions related to the call, please send them to programs@canary, and we'll make sure that they get answered by the right person.
Okay, we've got a question. Can in-kind salary with over 20% benefit count towards the matching contribution?
The answer is no. It would the maximum contribution of 20% for benefits has to be adhered to, so it would not be considered eligible, both for funding or for in-kind.
Another question, what kind of supporting documentation at the time of application do you need for budget lines detailing in-kind contributions of salary?
So at the time that you apply for funding, we don't ask for any supporting documentation. We ask for the supporting documentation once the funding has been announced and the agreement's been signed. So once the agreement's been signed, that's when we start asking for supporting documentation.
Laura, there's also a question in the chat window. And I can read it out if it's easier.
Yeah, Mark, that'd be great.
Yeah.
The question is, what sort of backup documentation, if any, is required in addition to the PI signed forms for hours, particularly for part-time FTEs?
So during the project, the supporting documentation that we would require kind of depends, but if it was straightforward, we'd be looking for proof of salary and benefits and the time record signed off by both the employee and the principal investigator. We wouldn't be looking for anything else typically.
One more question. For multi-institutional projects, would the agreement be done with all institutions involved?
Thank you. So that's a good question. So the way that it'll be structured is the lead contractor, so whomever is applying, if you are working with participants, we would expect a consortium agreement signed between your organization and the participant, and that agreement would reference back to the agreement signed with Canary. So that would be an agreement between what we refer to as the lead contractor and the participant. There would be one agreement between the lead contractor and Canary.
Okay, next question. Does the applicant need to be a faculty member to be a PI? Does their status matter? Can they be any university employee?
So I think the answer to that depends. We would certainly consider any employee. We would look at the application and assess it at that time. Typically, we see the PI coming. We typically see the PI being a faculty member, but we would evaluate it based on a review of the application.
Yeah, and I think the PI's CV is part of that application package, correct?
Yes, it is.
Tracy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't seem to have any more questions. Does anyone have any questions? Here we have one more. Can in-kind contributions include software and hardware?
So unfortunately, no, the in-kind contributions are limited to the salary and benefits of staff.
Can there be more than one PI, co-PIs?
The answer is yes. There would only be one PI, but co-PIs are acceptable. We see that we would accept them in the in-kind section of the budget.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I think we'll close this off, and we will be having another RDM webinar next week as well. Thank you very much for everyone signing in. Have a good day.